Never played on a record yet, and I still yet want to play one on a record.
James Brown shocks fans with rare confession about Elvis Presley. It was one of those moments that didn't sound real at first. A reporter had asked James Brown a routine question, something about Elvis Presley and influence, the kind of thing he'd brushed off 100 times before. But this time he paused, leaned back, and said the words that froze the room. People talk about Elvis being the king, but I was the one who taught the king how to move. The laughter that followed was nervous. They didn't know if he was joking. James didn't smile. His voice dropped low, almost like a preacher at the pulpit. No disrespect, but don't let nobody rewrite history. Elvis had soul, but I had it first. And just like that, the headlines wrote themselves. James Brown calls out Elvis. TV hosts replayed that clip on loop. Fans of both legends clashed in radio call-ins. Some accused him of jealousy. Others said he was finally telling the truth no one dared to say. But behind that soundbite was something deeper. Not arrogance, not rivalry, but years of quiet tension, buried respect, and an untold bond between two men who defined American music from opposite sides of the color line. Because what James Brown said that day wasn't just about a dance step. It was about the world he came from, the churches of the South, the juke joints, the sweat-soaked stages, and where rhythm was rebellion to him, soul wasn't sound. It was survival. And he'd watched for years as a white man from Tupelo took that same fire and made it global. Brown had every reason to resent it. In the 1950s, while he was still driving a bus between gigs and being turned away from hotels, Elvis Presley was on national television, shaking the same hips that got black performers banned from the airwaves. America crowned one dangerous and the other revolutionary. And yet, James couldn't bring himself to hate Elvis, because he saw something there, a rhythm that didn't come from imitation, but from pain. He'd later admit quietly that the first time he saw Elvis perform, he didn't see a thief. He saw a mirror. That boy had something you can't fake. He moved like he'd been touched by the same spirit. But no one wanted to hear that. The press wanted rivalry. The fans wanted a fight. So for years, James played into it, calling himself the real king, letting the tension build, never fully explaining what he meant. Until that interview. Until he decided late in his life to say what had been sitting in his chest since the 1950s, that behind the myth of competition was a complicated kind of brotherhood. One forged not in friendship, but in respect. Because the truth was, James Brown and Elvis Presley needed each other. One breaking color lines with gospel grit, the other breaking television screens with forbidden movement. Together, without ever planning it, they cracked America's idea of what a star could look like, sound like, or feel like. And when James made that confession, "I taught the king how to move," it wasn't an insult, it was a warning. A reminder that rhythm doesn't belong to race. That imitation without heart is just noise. That even kings learn from prophets who came before them. What fans didn't know was that behind closed doors, James had told people for years that Elvis treated him with respect. When reporters tried to bait him into trash talk, he'd shake his head. "Elvis? Nah, man, that cat had soul. He earned what he had." But in public, that truth didn't sell. So when he finally said it out loud, raw, unfiltered, maybe even a little bitter, the world heard confession, but not context. That single sentence, half pride, half pain, reopened a decades-old conversation about music, race, and legacy. Who really changed American sound? Who gave who permission to move, to feel, to cross invisible lines? James knew the answer wasn't neat, He knew history had already chosen its hero, but he also knew something history tends to forget, that behind every crowned king, there's someone who carried the fire first. And that's why his words mattered. Because when the Godfather of Soul finally spoke his truth, it wasn't just about Elvis. It was about America's blind spot, the refusal to see how connected these two men really were. What he said that night wasn't meant to divide. It was meant to remind that greatness doesn't come from imitation. It comes from the same pain, the same pulse. Whether you're born in a shack in Macon or a shotgun house in Tupelo. And what no one realized yet, not the fans, not the critics, not even the people who twisted his words, was that this confession wasn't the start of a feud. It was the start of a truth that would change how we see both legends forever. For years, they had circled each other like shadows. Two kings in different kingdoms who both ruled through rhythm. Elvis Presley, the Southern boy with the golden smile, and James Brown, the hustler from Georgia who turned poverty into performance. Each one had studied the other from a distance, long before they ever shook hands. James used to tell his band, "That white boy, he got something in his bones." He'd seen the clips on TV, Elvis on the Milton Berle show, hips moving like a gospel drumbeat. Church rhythm trapped inside a white man's frame. Brown didn't know whether to be impressed or insulted. The crowd screamed for what he'd been doing for years, and suddenly, it was called new. Still, he couldn't look away. Elvis had the same fever, the same desperation in his movements, the kind of energy that doesn't come from style, but from struggle. And somewhere in that, James recognized himself. Elvis, on the other hand, had already heard whispers about this man from Augusta, a performer so precise that his band members got fined for missing a beat. A man who could make an audience faint without touching them, and he wanted to see it with his own eyes. Their worlds collided sometime in the mid-60s, two performers who had both become legends before they'd even met. It wasn't an arranged meeting. It happened the way fate likes to work. Unplanned, electric, unforgettable. James was backstage after a show in Los Angeles when the door opened and the room went silent. In walked Elvis Presley, hair perfect, eyes calm, wearing that familiar mix of humility and command. James would later say, when he walked in, it felt like the room leaned toward him. But Elvis didn't come to steal the spotlight. He came to shake the hand of the man who made him better. "Mr. Brown," Elvis said, quiet but confident. "You don't know me, but I know you." James grinned, leaning back in his chair. "Oh, I know you. Baby, America won't let me forget you." The air hung thick between them. Two men who had been turned into symbols, one called the King, the other the Godfather, finally face to face with no cameras, no screaming fans, no stage to hide behind. Then James broke the tension the only way he knew how, with rhythm. He snapped his fingers, humming a groove, the same one he'd heard Elvis try to swing on TV. "Show me that move, man," he said, half joking. Elvis laughed, that deep Southern laugh that disarmed people instantly, and without hesitation, he moved. The step wasn't perfect, but it had feeling. It had weight. James clapped once. "That's it. That's it right there. You feel it. You don't fake it." They talked for over an hour that night about gospel choirs, juke joints, Sam Cooke, and the pressure of being worshipped and misunderstood. At the same time, Elvis admitted he'd studied James' footwork, the way he could turn an audience with just a pause or a scream. James admitted he'd envied Elvis's reach, the way he could take black rhythm into white living rooms without being banned from television. In that small room, There was no rivalry, no jealousy, just two artists who recognized the same madness in each other. They were both prisoners of performance, bound by the same invisible chains: expectation, addiction, exhaustion, and the endless need to prove something no one could define. Years later, when people tried to drag Elvis's name through the mud, calling him a thief of black culture, James stepped in. He told reporters, "Elvis didn't steal. Elvis opened the door. You can't steal what's in your blood." Those words shocked people. They didn't fit the narrative the world wanted. But Brown didn't care anymore about headlines. He'd lived too long and seen too much to play the old rivalry game. He understood that Elvis had suffered his own kind of isolation, the pressure of being worshipped and trapped at the same time. In one interview, Brown said softly, "We were both poor boys who found a stage before we found peace." He wasn't exaggerating. Both men had grown up in the Deep South, raised on gospel, molded by poverty, and driven by the same need to be seen, to be loved, to matter. It was never about skin. It was about survival. And as James grew older, his confession deepened. He started to see Elvis not as a rival, but as a mirror of what fame does to a man. The fame that feeds you and kills you at the same time. The fame that promises freedom but turns you into property. After Elvis died, Brown broke down on stage. He didn't plan to. It just came out mid-performance when someone in the crowd yelled, "Say something about Elvis." He paused, tears running down his face, and said, "He was my brother. Don't you forget that." The crowd didn't know what to do with that. Some clapped, others went silent. But James kept talking. "You don't know what we shared. You don't know how hard he fought to be himself. Same fight I fought, same pain, different face." That moment never made the front pages. But to those who were there, it was unforgettable. It wasn't just grief. It was understanding. It was the Godfather of Soul finally acknowledging that the King of Rock had carried the same cross. Because deep down, James Brown had realized the truth that history rarely admits, that Elvis didn't just borrow rhythm, he carried the burden of it. He brought black sound to white audiences, but in doing so, he took their hatred too. He broke barriers, but they broke him back. And that's what James meant when he said Elvis had soul, real soul, the kind that comes from hurt. He wasn't just defending a man, he was defending a truth. That pain recognizes pain. That greatness doesn't come from imitation, but from the fire that refuses to die out, no matter who's watching. By the end of his life, James stopped calling Elvis the King. He called him a brother, because finally, he saw what he'd been missing all along, that the King of Rock and the Godfather of Soul weren't competitors in a game of fame. They were two sons of the South, both baptized in gospel, both scarred by struggle, both crowned by music that came from the same sacred place, the heart. By the time James Brown reached his final years, his body had slowed down, but his mind hadn't lost its rhythm. He'd outlived many of the giants who'd shared the stage of history with him: Ray, Sam, Otis, Elvis. Each one carried a piece of the American story inside their voice, but only a few carried its contradictions so clearly. And as James sat for one of his last in-depth interviews, someone asked him again about Elvis Presley. He could have dodged it. He could have repeated the same lines that had kept him safe for decades. But this time he didn't. He leaned forward, eyes soft but certain, and said, "Elvis didn't steal the soul. He felt it. That's why people still feel him." The room went silent. It wasn't a soundbite. It was a confession, a kind of forgiveness. James had spent a lifetime wrestling with fame, injustice, and the question of who gets remembered. But in that moment, he let go of the bitterness and replaced it with truth. Because what he'd learned after all the noise faded was that both he and Elvis had paid the same toll. Different roads, same pain. Elvis had broken barriers without meaning to. He carried black music into white homes, but he carried their hate with it. Every time he swung his hips, churchmen cursed him, politicians warned parents, and censors threatened to cut him off the air. Meanwhile, James fought the same war from the other side, preaching pride, dignity, and rhythm in a country that still saw his color before his sound. They'd both lived trapped between gratitude and guilt, worshiped publicly, lonely, privately. And James understood that better than anyone. He once told a friend, "People think Elvis was built for fame, but fame built walls around him." It was the same thing that had happened to him. Different names, same prison. So when he made that final confession, it wasn't just about Elvis. It was about setting himself free from the narrative that had kept both men misunderstood, because the truth wasn't that Elvis took from black music. The truth was that both black and white America took from each other and made something neither could have made alone. That's why James defended Elvis till the very end. When reporters tried to stir controversy by asking if Elvis had stolen the blues, he'd cut them off. If Elvis stole, then we all stole. Because music don't belong to race, it belongs to the soul. There was no bitterness left in his tone, only peace. He saw now that history had a cruel way of choosing its heroes, but the rhythm beneath it all was shared. Elvis had his gospel, James had his funk, but both carried the same spirit, the same drive to turn pain into power, to turn silence into sound. And when James died in 2006, one of the old recordings that played at his private service was "If I Can Dream," a song Elvis recorded in 1968, drenched in hope and heartbreak, begging for a world that could finally see beyond division. Those who knew James said he'd asked for that song because it reminded him of everything they'd both believed in, but rarely said out loud. He'd once told a reporter, "Me and Elvis, we didn't need to talk much. We understood." That understanding had outlasted the arguments, the rumors, the headlines. In the end, what James Brown left behind wasn't just funk, it was perspective. He had finally reached the point where rivalry turned into reverence, where one legend could look at another and see not competition, but continuation. When he said those final words, Elvis didn't steal the soul. He felt it. He was doing something rare in music history, closing a wound instead of reopening it. And for a brief moment, even the critics went quiet, because there was no debate left to have. Just two men, two worlds, one truth. That genius doesn't care what color you are when it finds you. That's what James meant by feeling it. That's why Elvis still moves people, and why James still echoes through every heartbeat of rhythm today. Both men carried America's contradictions inside them, and turned it into music that could make the whole world dance. They didn't just play songs, they played history. And whether the world ever truly understood it or not, James Brown's final confession wasn't just about Elvis Presley, it was about redemption for both of them. Two men, two legacies, one shared soul. James Brown's confession didn't rewrite history, it revealed it. If you believe the greatest stories are the ones that bridge worlds instead of dividing them, subscribe and join us, because the next Legend's truth will challenge everything you think you know.